Boy, the Trump administration really seemed to be mincing their words when it comes to this obvious terrorist attack launched against the Naval Air Base at Pensacola. The Secretary of Defense was interviewed just this week, and he refused to label this attack an act of terror. This is kind of funny to me because this reminds me a lot of, the Obama administration. It was something that Republicans always criticized the Obama folks for. It's like, oh my gosh, why can't you label this what it is? Radical Islamic terrorism. What was the thing they used to say? How can you begin to fight the problem if you won't even name it? And all of the indignation for 8 years about how, oh my God, Obama's soft on terrorists. He's, of course, no one ever said this publicly, but the voters thought he was a closeted Muslim. That's why he was so soft on all these terror attacks and why he wouldn't name them. But now that old Trump is in office, well, we don't have to worry about that anymore because Trump's not afraid to say radical Islamic terrorism. Yet here we are, Trump's president, and the government is doing the exact same thing. They're mincing their words. They're trying not to offend anyone, and they don't want to call out and use the vulgar language of the common people when it comes to describing these sorts of incidents. And Trump personally has even gone so far as to praise the Saudis in wake of the attack and say what great allies they are and how they're so sympathetic to us and how, oh, they're so wonderful, they would never do anything like this. We love Saudi Arabia. Aren't they great? I mean, that was his response to this attack, was to say how great the Saudis are. I mean, this is akin almost, but I mean, not quite, obviously. There's many differences, and I'll get to that. But this is almost, from a public relations standpoint, akin to if Lyndon Johnson had come out in, the days following the USS Liberty incident and said, don't we love Israel? Aren't they our greatest ally? I mean, sure, they sunk our ship, but no, they love us. They love Israel is our greatest perfect people. We love them. They could never do any wrong. If those soldiers are dead, they deserved it, blah, blah, blah. And that's basically what Trump has done here. Of course, he's done it in a way to try and exonerate the Saudi royal family, which honestly is not something I disagree with. I don't think that the Saudis are themselves are really to blame here. I don't think that this is because of them funding terrorism and the radical mosques and all that, which they do. That's something they should be called out for. But this doesn't seem to be a case of that, as I said before. This guy seemed to be motivated purely by politics. He didn't, in his post, his suicide note that he left. He didn't say anything about how, oh, I hate that women in America are allowed to wear bikinis and they don't cover their head and they're just, and these American men, they're not good fathers and I hate American culture, so I'm going to try and kill some infidels. He didn't say anything about that. What he said was, hey, American foreign policy is evil. You guys do a lot of bad stuff, so I'm going to do some bad stuff to try and get revenge on you. This guy was politically motivated. I don't see any other way to spin it. He left a pretty clear note. He even said, I don't hate your freedom. He's mocking the typical response like we used to get from George W. Bush of like, oh, these Muslim guys, they're so scary and they don't want our culture to exist on this planet and they want to wipe us off the face of the earth. And he's like, no, I don't care what you do. Just stop bombing people. But of course, he had a terrible response to that, which is I'm going to go kill innocent people myself. Nonetheless, this was an act of terror, because he was trying to achieve some political goal by using violence, which, of course, by that logic, you could say that all government action is terrorism, since they're trying to achieve political goals through violence. But that's beside the point. By the standard definition that everyone uses of what terrorism is, this guy is a terrorist very clearly. Just look at his note. He didn't suddenly snap and go crazy, and that's why he killed people. He had a motivation. This was premeditated. He went out and bought a gun recently. He loaded up a few mags. I guess it's common for people who own guns to have a few loaded mags sitting around. So that by itself maybe is not premeditation. But taking it in the aggregate, it seems to support the case, along with all this other evidence, that this guy was premeditated, that he planned this out. And, of course, the fact that he was watching, he had a watch party for a bunch of mass shooting videos with a few of his closest pals the night before he went off and killed a bunch of people. So he certainly had this, somewhere in the back of his mind that he was going to go kill people that day. And really, I'm surprised that nobody found it at all weird that this guy from Saudi Arabia was watching a bunch of mass shooting videos with his buddies, and invited them over to watch. It just seems like something that would set off some red flags for people. But I guess nobody said anything until it was too late, and that only now that they're being questioned by the FBI are they bringing these things up. Now, I said earlier that I don't think that it's fair to blame Saudi Arabia as a whole for this, and that I don't necessarily disagree with Trump's characterization of it that way. But there are actual reasons why people are blaming Saudi Arabia, other than past performance. The other Saudis who were on base with this guy, who were also students, a few of them apparently seemed not too worried about being shot when he opened fire, almost like they were somewhat tipped off ahead of time that they knew he was going to do this, because 3 or 4 of them apparently whipped out their phones and decided to videotape it. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were in a normal, non-war zone, peaceful place in America, and suddenly I heard someone start, shooting a bunch in my general vicinity, I'd get the hell out of there. I wouldn't stop to see who was doing it. I wouldn't try and, attack him probably, unless I was armed. But I can tell you the last thing I would do is stand there like a sitting duck and whip out my phone and start videotaping it. That is, unless perhaps you had some assurance that you would not be shot, that he was not after you, and that, this would make a cool video. Almost gives me the impression that this guy's plan was to commit this terrorist attack and then have his friends upload it to Twitter or something, and then have this video floating around to terrorize Americans and say, "Oh, see, this is our response to you doing bad things in the Middle East. We're getting some revenge here." Of course, for whatever reason, I guess those videos were never uploaded. Perhaps these guys were detained almost immediately, because I have to imagine it looks pretty suspicious if everyone's running around and scurrying trying to escape the gunman, and then you've got these 3 or 4 other guys just crowded around him like groupies. That certainly seems to indicate that there was some kind of conspiracy here between the men, all of whom were Saudis, and that therefore the Saudi government may be involved to some extent too, and that they sent them there specifically to do that. That's not a totally far-fetched, conclusion to come to, although I don't think it's the correct one. And as I said the other day, the reason for that is that this guy's motivations conflict with Saudi foreign policy, because Saudi foreign policy is very closely tied to American foreign policy. The Saudi royal family very close to the United States. And so to the extent that this Saudi military officer had a problem with American foreign policy, he really was going against the interests of his own government. Now, the U.S. military, along with Trump and the Secretary of Defense, don't seem concerned at all with Saudi Arabia, which again is to a fault. Even though in this case they are correct, they are way too soft and lenient when it comes to Saudi Arabia in almost every other case. But the military now is being kind of, I don't know if you would use the term defiant, but they seem to have a bit of a cavalier attitude about Esper's crumb that he gave to the American people of saying, "Oh, well, we'll review this whole exchange student process and see how maybe it can be improved." And he didn't say anything about canceling Saudis from coming here. But in response to the governor of Florida, who was pretty upset and said, "Hey, how'd you let this guy into my state?" Which, governors are pretty powerless these days when it comes to immigration, thanks to the Supreme Court back in, it was during Reconstruction, I think they made that decision. But that's a topic for another day. Esper was saying, we'll review this whole process, and it's up for consideration, which is just something you throw out in the media. Nothing ever comes from that. They do an investigation, and then they decide, they do an investigation into whether or not they should start an investigation, and then they decide, we don't need one, and then nothing comes of it. So this is just something to make the story go away. But the military's coming out and saying, no, nothing's going to happen. Trust us. We have no reason to change anything. This program's great. We love it. We're going to keep sending Americans to Saudi Arabia, and we're going to keep bringing Saudi Arabians to America, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. Which is probably true, The elected people, not that you could ever really elect someone who was going to go against what the military wants, but even if you did, they don't really listen to outside input very much. Now, with that said, I am kind of disappointed that all the energy generated and the passion generated amongst ordinary people when it comes to this situation has been channeled at the Saudis, which, is good. I'm glad that people don't like the Saudis, but in this case, what really is the culprit here is blowback. Nobody's even seems to be talking about it, let alone acting concerned about it. Nobody's really concerned that this guy launched an attack on us because of the atrocities committed by the U.S. military in the Middle East. No one's even questioning that, hey, if we're going to provoke these kinds of very awful acts of terror against our own people in America by being in the Middle East, is that perhaps worth it? No one really seems to be questioning anything that fundamental. They're just questioning the specific relationship with Saudi Arabia. And so that's disappointing. And as I said before, nothing will change because of that. That is the big issue here. That is why these things keep happening. That's why 9/11 happened. People are very honest about that. That's why lots of these terrorist attacks happen. And now, some of them are religiously motivated and not politically motivated. It happens. And some, of course, are a mixture of both. 9/11, of course, being in that category, that they were specifically upset that U.S. troops were in the Islamic Holy Land. They didn't like that there were U.S. troops, that they were infidels on Saudi Arabian soil. That was a big, big part of their motivation if you look at their documents. But in few cases is it purely a religious thing. But as people are pointing out now, those purely religious attacks could be prevented if Saudi Arabia was not funding all of these radical Sunni mosques around the world, which is what they do. They fund these mosques that have ideologies and things that tell their flock to go commit acts of terror and to kill themselves and to commit suicide attacks. And so really all these forms of terrorism perpetrated by Middle Easterners could be, in theory, ended and prevented from happening again, at least in any regular way, in any sustained way, in any pattern, in two ways. One, the U.S. could stop funding Saudi Arabia and let them collapse, because without really U.S. assistance, the Saudis probably would lose their control over their country, and there would be some kind of revolution, and some other government would take over. Now, of course, I'm assuming that that new government wouldn't also fund the radical mosques that the Saudis are, so that perhaps that's a hole in the plan. But perhaps, since the U.S. has so much power over Saudi Arabia anyway, we can just pressure them to not fund these mosques anymore. And so that would deal with the religious part of the problem. Now, the other part of the problem is the political problem, which is the blowback from the U.S. Waging all these wars in the Middle East and making so many people hate us. That, of course, could be solved by pulling out of the Middle East. So it does seem like you could come up with a somewhat of a plan to try and stop these terrorist attacks and prevent them from happening. But people aren't really there yet. I don't think that they're ready to discuss that sort of thing, because that, in a way, I think in people's minds, even though this is dumb, they would say, well, then that's like we're admitting blame. And it's like, well, I mean, yeah, you'd have to admit blame for provoking these people. So who cares? As long as you get the attacks to stop, well, what's the big deal? But it's a pride thing. I don't think folks are ready to accept it. I think if you said that to most Americans, they'd just say, like, oh, well, you hate America. It's like, which is a very dumb, low IQ response, but hey, what are you going to do? That's the state we live in. So these terrorist attacks, again, will continue to keep happening. If you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.